Part 4, Missouri Irish, A History of the Irish in America, by Michael C. O'Laughlin. Copyright 2010, from the Irish Roots Cafe and irishroots.com.
A chart of the populations of major frontier cities in 1880 is shown on page 82 of the text. The story of the Irish in St. Louis from 1770. Early settlers: Brady and McKnight, Mullanphy, O'Reilly, O'Connor, the Kerry Patch, the Murphy Wagon, politics, organizations, and education. St. Louis Irish. Historian Frederick Billen gives us the adult male population of St. Louis in the years 1817 to 1820. From his estimates, the Irish were 1/7 of the total population and the largest foreign-born group in the city. Only those of American birth outnumbered the Irish-born. His analysis was as follows. The population, quote, was in round numbers about 700, divided about as follows. Of American birth, say 400. Original French and Spanish, 150. And of foreign birth, 150. Of these last, fully 2/3, or about 100, were Irishmen, some 15 to 20 European Frenchmen, about the same number of English and Scotsmen, and some 10 or 12 Germans. Unquote. Quote, of our Irish citizens of that day in St. Louis included in their number a very liberal proportion of gentlemen of education and acquirements, some of whom held important positions in our then recently acquired territory. I instance James Rankin, our first, and Jeremiah Connor, our second sheriff, Moses Scott, Thomas McGuire, William Sullivan, Patrick Walsh, Justices of the Peace, Luke E. Lawless, attorney, afterwards judge, Joseph Charles and James C. Cummins, first and second proprietors of the Missouri Gazette, John and Thomas McKnight, John and Thomas Brady, John Mullanphy, Thomas Hanley, Patrick Dillon, James Arnold, John Crawford, Hugh Rankin, Andrew Elliott, Robert H. Catherwood, James Timon, Sr., father of the late Reverend Bishop Timon of Buffalo, Michael Daly, all merchants, Major Thomas Forsyth, United States Indian Agent, Major James McGonigal, Quartermaster, United States Army, James Nagel, Arthur L. McGinnis, lawyers, Patrick Sullivan, professor at the college, Francis Rochford, teacher, Matthew Murphy, and others whose names do not occur to me. All these were here in the territorial days of St. Louis. Unquote. It is obvious that the Irish were a substantial part of early Missouri history and were of incalculable service, far beyond the limited notion of being strictly hard laborers who arrived during the famine era in Ireland. Leading citizens of St. Louis prior to 1810. Jeremiah Connor was a leading citizen of St. Louis from 1805 until his death in 1823. According to verbal testimony, he came from County Cork, Ireland. Appointed sheriff of St. Louis by the governor in 1806, he held that office until 1810. Considering his recent arrival, this was strong testimony as to his character. In 1809, Connor was one of only 2 witnesses to Governor Lewis' last will and testament. Active in real estate transactions, he is documented as Justice of the Peace on several occasions in 1818. Politically and in matters of law and order, Connor was a prominent individual. He not only served as sheriff, town collector, treasurer, and auctioneer prior to 1810, but as justice of the peace as late as 1818. The condition of the jail he ran left much to be desired. Connor not only petitioned for a new jail, but offered to donate the land needed to build a new one. It seems that a few prisoners had been able to break out of the makeshift jail through no fault of the sheriff. Jeremiah Connor was the founder and president of the first ethnic organization in St. Louis in 1818. Irish immigrants were beginning to arrive in greater numbers. Men like Joseph Murphy would arrive that year and be in need of assistance. Murphy had no home, no job, and had just stepped off the boat, still a young boy. With help from local residents, Murphy overcame these obstacles. Many others would find help in St. Louis from the members of the Aaron Benevolent Society. On February 13, 1818, an article in the St. Louis Republican noted a meeting at Connor's house on February 9th to form a benevolent society. Thomas Brady was chairman and Thomas Hanley was secretary. Apparently, their experience in the Freemasons helped them organize this society. A resolution was adopted stating, quote, that we have formed ourselves into an Irish immigrant and corresponding society, unquote. A committee of 5 was formed that day, including Jeremiah Connor, John Mullanphy, James McGonigal, Alexander Blackwell, and Arthur McGinnis. This is the first example of such an organization being formed in Missouri that we know of. On October 21, 1819, Jeremiah Connor was declared president of the Aaron Benevolent Society. Food, clothing, and assistance were thereby supplied to new immigrants, including non-Irish. In addition to the names already cited, Mr. Hugh Rankin served as treasurer, Lawrence Ryan as secretary, and the standing committee included Thomas English, James Timon, Robert H. Catherud, Joseph Charles, and Hugh O'Neill. These individuals were responsible for the growth of St. Louis before it was declared a territory in 1812. Connor was one of the greatest benefactors to the Catholic Church of the day. Only John Mullanphy would donate more. While both men were Catholics, Connor was an active Freemason, as were fellow Irish Catholics Thomas Brady and Thomas Hanley. Jeremiah Connor was as active in church affairs as he was in civic activities. He donated $1,000, the largest sum donated, for the acquisition of the residence quarters for the bishop. He also collected $1,172 for the subsequent building of the cathedral. He was on a list of pew holders in 1818. Along with 4 other Irishmen, he signed a document guaranteeing Bishop Dubourg free use of the cathedral building site, unencumbered. Thomas Brady, John Little, Thomas McGuire, and Joseph Charles were the others. Charles, who was a member of Connor's Benevolent Society, was a Presbyterian. He preached through his newspaper unity and cooperation among all groups. His deeds in this era prove this out. Connor's real estate included 2 40-arpent lots. It ran from 3rd Street west to Jefferson Avenue, 1.5 miles between the property of Major William Christie on the north and Judge Lucas on the south. He donated a strip of property 50 feet wide to the city. That land became Washington Avenue, a most important thoroughfare of St. Louis. William Christie would sell property to a young man by the name of Joseph Murphy in the 1820s. It has been said that 25% of his property was donated for public use, including property given to the church. His real estate holdings included land in New Madrid and along the Mississippi. He was one of the 6 owners of all the land west of 4th Street, according to Scharf. William Christie, William C. Carr, Robert Wash, and Auguste Choteau were the others. On at least one occasion, he donated land with the provision that it was to be used to build a school. Connor had more than a passing interest in education. In 1819, he was among the first to submit a proposal for a community library. Like John Mullanphy of his own generation and Joseph Murphy of the next, he valued an education and knew the importance of books and libraries. Joseph Murphy had just struck out on his own in the last year or so when Jeremiah Connor died. They had likely met, at least casually, in such a small town with a tight-knit Irish settlement. Jeremiah's reputation had preceded him, no doubt, and left the boy in awe of some of his accomplishments. Murphy would make some outstanding accomplishments on his own. A fortnight before his death, his name appeared on the Committee for the Supervision of the Streets and Alleys and the Condemnation of Property. 2 weeks later, a brief one-line obituary appeared in the Missouri Republican on September 24, 1823. The Republican was the paper started by fellow Irishman and member of Connor's Benevolent Society, Joseph Charles. It was a brief notice indeed for the passing of such a great leader. Colonel John O'Fallon was appointed administrator of his estate by the General Court of the state of Missouri. Missouri had come to be a state in the Union, due in no small part to the energies and generosity of men like Jeremiah Connor, who arrived prior to 1810. Thomas Brady and John McKnight. Brady and McKnight contributed to the development of St. Louis in its territorial days. Merchants and developers of the area after arriving in 1809, local historians agree that they had been business partners in Pittsburgh earlier. Taking a keel boat down the Ohio and up the Mississippi rivers, their families and goods were on board. Soon after they docked in St. Louis, the Creole residents of the town dubbed them the Irish crowd. Charles had already begun his paper in St. Louis. Jeremiah Connor had been sheriff for a number of years. The first millionaire west of the Mississippi, John Mullanphy, had arrived 4 years ago. Immigration from Ireland on a regular basis would not begin for another 5 to 10 years. Brady and McKnight firmly believed that this was the area of the future. Just as Charles had preached in his paper, they knew that the West held the future growth of America. Brady, born on March 17, 1781 in Ireland, was 28 years old upon arrival. Like other Irishmen of the day, his business activities played a major role in the development of the state of Missouri. He saw the territory declared a state in 1821. Major William Christie and Robert Campbell, born 1804 in County Tyrone, Ireland, were 2 more Irish-American pioneers. Christie arrived in 1804, Campbell in 1824 in St. Louis. A short 4 years after arrival, Brady was elected under the territorial legislature as commissioner to receive subscriptions to the first bank, the Bank of St. Louis. When the second bank was organized, the Bank of Missouri, he was elected to the board of directors in 1820. The Irish played an active role in banking in early St. Louis. William O'Hara conducted a private bank in 1818. Several others would follow suit in this industry in the decades to come. In 1816, Brady was appointed commissioner by the Circuit Court for the erection of a county jail, along with William Christie and others. In 1818, he presided at the first meeting of the Aaron Benevolent Society at the home of Sheriff Jeremiah Connor. As chairman at that first meeting, he commanded a good deal of respect from the leaders of the community, A Roman Catholic by religion, he was also a member of the Masonic Order. Thomas Brady was an officer of the Masonic Order and active in the organization, as were other Irish Catholics. John McKnight. The son of Timothy McKnight, John was a native of Ireland who settled in Augusta County, Virginia, in 1774. Upon arriving in St. Louis, he brought his parents and several brothers and sisters with him. Shortly after arrival, he served on the grand jury. He was also a commissioner of the Bank of Missouri. McKnight and Thomas Brady bought the land on which East St. Louis and Harrisonville were built. From his position on the grand jury, he would have been acquainted with the sheriff, Jeremiah Connor. The firm of McKnight and Brady dissolved in 1820. McKnight joined his brother Robert, trading with the Indians and Mexicans in the Southwest at Santa Fe. The development of the Santa Fe trade route would become vital in later years. Settlers followed in wagons and by rail, fulfilling the American destiny. Robert Campbell came to the area as a fur trader and partner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. In 1846, when the Mexican War began, he was a key man in furnishing supplies to the American troops. A large donor to the famine-struck people of Ireland at that time, the Campbell House became a St. Louis landmark. Irishmen like Campbell, McKnight, and Joseph Murphy would play a vital role in opening up the West. Robert McKnight had traded in the area earlier and spent 10 years in Mexican jails as a result. Serving as an example to discourage other American traders, earlier efforts to free him had been in vain. In the fall of 1822, the two brothers and 8 companions left for Comanche country. John McKnight was killed on this expedition, likely by the Indians he went to trade with. The Indians who were found with some of his possessions claimed that he was dead when they found him. Retribution for his death was made on the spot. Family members disagreed on the cause of his death. It seems as though there was not a mark on his body. It might have been a heart attack, an illness which ran in the younger generations of the family. The end of an era. The era of Brady and McKnight was a romantic one. Almost immediately upon arrival, they opened up shop. By 1811, they were the second largest taxpayers in town. That same year, they purchased land in the business heart of the village of St. Louis and carried on trade for 6 years. They also established the first branch stores in St. Genevieve and St. Charles, important trade centers for the area. A full-size buffalo was the emblem of Brady and McKnight's 2-story Missouri hotel, erected in 1816. At their hotel, the first celebration of Washington's birthday took place, west of the river. The first state legislature assembled, and the first governor of Missouri, Alexander McNair, took his oath of office there. 2 U.S. senators from Missouri were elected by the legislature here as well. After Brady's death, the hotel passed to Major Thomas Biddle, the son-in-law of John Mullanphy. In 1818, they had made the first recorded plot of East St. Louis. Around 1820, they bought and operated the St. Louis Ferry, which had earlier been called Campbell's Ferry, but was originally founded by Captain James Pigot, spelled Piggott. Brady and McKnight dealt extensively in real estate. During 15 years of business, a large part of St. Louis passed through their hands, including lands in Illinois. These 2 pioneer merchants arrived in St. Louis as strangers, remaining only 15 years. They rose rapidly and worthily in the esteem of the community. The Irish crowd built up the largest mercantile establishment in the city, which was little more than a trading post when they first arrived. Branch stores were opened in both Illinois and Missouri. John and Robert McKnight developed important trade relations with the Southwest. They paved the way for the caravans that followed in the 1840s. They paid a high price. John McKnight died on his last expedition at the hands of the Indians. Robert McKnight spent 10 years in a Mexican prison as a result of a much earlier expedition. Other pioneers would follow these early explorers. On March 20th, 1822, Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick answered an ad for explorers to ascend the Mississippi from St. Louis. By 1834, he was a principal of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Note: there are 2 Thomas Bradys in the records of St. Clair County with no known connection between them. The elder Brady came from Maryland to Cahokia before the Revolution. His wife saved the village from Indian massacre several times and supplied George Rogers Clark's regiment at Cahokia in 1778. He died in 1794, leaving no issue, although Baptiste Brady, his son, was on the 1787 Cahokia census. This Brady also went on an expedition against the Miami Indians. The first millionaire. Quote, "A man of great enterprise, foresight, and judgment, he contributed more than any other individual to the building of St. Louis." Unquote. Darby, 4 times mayor of St. Louis, made this statement describing the attributes of John Mullanphy. Described as red-faced and weather-beaten, John Mullanphy was said to have been the first millionaire west of the Mississippi. He was born in County Fermanagh, Ireland, in 1758, before St. Louis was founded. Deprived of a formal education, he began a program of self-education in Dublin. He read extensively while caring for an invalid who lived above a bookstore, to which he had free access. John Mullanphy came to have one of the finest libraries in Western America many years later. Leaving Ireland and the bookshop, he became an officer in the Irish Brigades of France. His experience with the French helped him achieve success in the former French trading post of St. Louis. His son Brian would later receive his education in France. The educational facilities of St. Louis were no match for those of Europe. John Mullanphy fought in the Irish Brigades until their dissolution, returned to Ireland, and married Elizabeth Brown of Youghal, County Waterford. He traveled with wife and child successively to New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in 1792. While in Baltimore, he became a close and trusted friend of Bishop John Carroll, the first American bishop. In 1799, he moved to Frankfort, Kentucky, and opened a bookstore. While in Lexington later, he engaged in the West Indian trade. After several successful voyages, his ship was lost at sea. Mullanphy left Frankfort with his wife, 4 young daughters, infant son, and several Negro servants, heading for St. Louis around 1804. That year, America had acquired the lands of Missouri, and Mullanphy saw the potential for growth in the area. A letter in the Baltimore Cathedral archives states that in that year, he had purchased a home and was associate judge in the Court of Common Pleas in St. Louis. His appointment as judge was one of the first made after the Louisiana Purchase. He would serve as alderman after the city incorporated in 1809. To what extent these titles were honorary, we have no information, but he was absent from the city a great deal of the time. He would make regular trips back east each year, bringing goods for sale and trade on the frontier. Mullanphy came, as many others had to St. Louis, by way of flatboat down the Ohio River. His knowledge of the French language and his shrewd business sense enabled him to prosper. A man of vision, much of his energy and wealth were spent in building up the city. Leaving soon after arrival in St. Louis, he sought better educational facilities for his children. John Mullanphy would have a family of 15 children in his lifetime. He had always referred to St. Louis as home, and in 1819 he returned to the city. His son became the president of the DePaul Society at the cathedral and one of the wealthiest men of his day. Mullanphy's gold. John Mullanphy's gold bullion and specie from England was accepted as a base for capital in a branch bank of the United States in St. Louis. He was a director of the National Bank from 1829 until his death in 1833. He continued the Irish trend in banking, as had Brady, McKnight, and O'Hara earlier in St. Louis. A member of the first ethnic organization of its kind in the territory of Missouri, Mullanphy never forgot his Irish roots. The object of the organization was to promote and aid Irish immigration. Those who first formed this organization are often found in the annals of St. Louis history. Mullanphy is no exception. In 1818, he attempted to establish a colony of Celts on the rich farmland near Florissant, but this proved unsuccessful on the whole. Joseph Murphy would come to St. Louis as a boy from Ireland in search of his family settlement near Florissant. Mullanphy held the mortgage on the property. Mullanphy's corner on cotton constituted the basis for his wealth. He moved from that market into real estate interest. Much of his wealth was donated to charities. He gave a 99-year lease on 960 acres of land to the Religious of the Sacred Heart in Florissant, with the proviso that an orphan home be settled. He made a like offer to the Jesuits of St. Louis University, a home for boys, and the first orphan home and academy for girls were established through his generosity. He also established the first hospital west of the Mississippi as a philanthropic act. Madam's Maryville College was founded through Mullanphy and the Sisters of Charity, whom he brought to St. Louis. These are but a few examples of his overwhelming generosity. Mullanphy supported private charities as well. He is known to have anonymously fed the poor, brought medical services in cholera epidemics, and furnished needed medicines to the afflicted. His generosity in establishing orphan homes across the country was extensive. In the cholera epidemic of 1832, Mullanphy doors were open to all. In 1847, the Famine immigrants settled on part of the Mullanphy estate and again received their generosity. This settlement was the beginning of the Kerry Patch in St. Louis. John Mullanphy died on August 29, 1833, and was laid to rest in Calvary Cemetery, where many of the family were buried. His obituary appeared in the local diocesan newspaper, The Shepherd of the Valley, and read as follows: Died in this city of the 29 ultimo, John Mullanphy, Esquire, in the 64th year of his age. In his death, the orphan and afflicted have lost a most liberal benefactor, and literature a firm promoter. May he rest in peace." Unquote. John Mullanphy belonged to the first generation of Irish-American builders. He built well and lastingly in stone and in the hearts of the poor and afflicted. While rendering great aid, he insisted that people learn to help themselves. Considered the wealthiest man in the Mississippi Valley, he was uncompromising in principle. Exhibiting justice and charity, he expected to find it in others. His family, including his wife, Lady Mullanphy, carried on his charitable traditions in his absence. Stories and legends about the Mullanphy family are still told by some St. Louis residents. It is one of the few names remembered from the early days of St. Louis. His activities stretched across the ocean and to all parts of America. North of Missouri, he owned land upon which Dubuque, Iowa, was built. Mullanphy was also the largest single stockholder in the Louisville and Portland Canal. Mullanphy contributions continue. Charles Chambers was the son of one of the oldest stationers and publishers in the city of Dublin. Born there in 1784, he fled Ireland in the year of the 1798 rebellion. Charles Chambers married Jane Mullanphy, the daughter of John, in 1817. They are found in St. Louis by 1819. Another of Mullanphy's daughters, Anne Mullanphy Biddle, donated the land on which St. Patrick's Church was built. These are a few examples of the second generation of Mullanphys in America. Bryan Mullanphy was the son of John Mullanphy and carried on the family traditions in the public life of St. Louis. While studying in France, as a youth, he met the founder of the St. Vincent de Paul Society. Upon Bryan's return to St. Louis, he would found a branch of the charitable society there. Dennis Galvin and James McGuire, Jr. would serve as officers in the society, and many prominent Irish would become members. Joseph Murphy, builder of the Murphy wagon, was among the ranks of the society. Murphy arrived as a homeless youth in St. Louis at a time when the Mullanphys were well established. It is said that Bryan Mullanphy held the property to which Joseph Murphy had been traveling. Their relationship would last the rest of their lives. Bryan must have been as headstrong as his father, for he was disinherited by his father in his will. His 7 sisters, however, gave him an equal share of the will. Bryan Mullanphy spent his adult life in the city of St. Louis. In 1847, he served as mayor of the city at the height of the famine in Ireland. He allowed the new Irish immigrants to settle on parts of the Mullanphy estate. He personally saw that food and medicine were supplied during the cholera epidemics, just as his father had done earlier. He also served as circuit court judge in the city. Bryan and the Mullanphy name died in 1851. At the age of 42, Bryan left 1/3 of his surviving fortune to, quote, all poor travelers on their way, bona fide, to settle in the West, unquote. His monies were said to have totaled nearly $2 million. Bryan also fostered the vocation and education of the Reverend John O'Hanlon, the future author of Lives of the Irish Saints. Bishop Kenrick. Kenrick had the unbroken generosity of the Mullanphy family. He handled large amounts of currency as a result of that, as well as money from the working-class residents of the city. When the national currency became sound in 1868-1869, he liquidated his banking business. Peter Richard Kenrick of St. Louis was born in Dublin on August 17, 1806. That same year in St. Louis, Father Flynn served as the first priest stationed in the city. Kenrick came to his brother's residence in Philadelphia in 1833. He succeeded to the Archbishopric of St. Louis in 1847 at the height of the famine in Ireland. Prior to Kenrick's initial arrival in 1841, the population of the city was 20,000. Half of the population was Catholic, of French, English, Irish, and German descent. The majority of the English-speaking Catholics were Irish and worshipped at the cathedral. Early St. Louis was predominantly Roman Catholic with little religious conflict. The 1840s saw some disturbing developments. Anti-immigrant feelings began to increase as the number of foreign-born residents steadily rose. The Irish and German Catholics, the largest immigrant groups, bore the brunt of the attacks. Official newspapers appeared in opposition to the immigrants, and riots ensued. As the famine Irish continued to arrive in the late 1840s, matters became worse. Perhaps the worst riot of all would take place in 1854. The St. Louis Irish formed the Shamrock Society to relieve the victims of the riot. Bishop Kenrick blessed the cornerstone of St. Patrick's Church at its dedication ceremonies. The Irish quickly grew large enough to warrant establishing other parishes. With the help of the pre-famine Irish immigrants such as Edward Walsh and Hugh O'Neill, St. Francis Xavier and other parishes would soon come into being. The first complete seminary for young men west of the Mississippi was founded by him in 1848. This establishment played an important role in further settlement and conversion throughout the West. In the field of communications, he was responsible for the publication of many works. The Shepherd of the Valley, the first diocesan publication, was among them and was of wide influence. Kenrick became the first bishop and the first archbishop of the area. The Reverend Patrick Ryan, later Archbishop of Philadelphia, had been born in County Tipperary. Reverend Peter Donnelly of County Roscommon served the area as the only priest who could hear confessions in Gaelic. Both of these men assisted Kenrick in St. Louis. Father Ryan sent for the Reverend Thomas A. Butler of Dublin, who had established the first cooperative colony of immigrants in the United States. He brought 600 settlers from Ireland to what is now Butler City, Kansas. In 1866, he arrived at St. John's in St. Louis at the request of Father Ryan. He subsequently became pastor at St. James and St. Cronan's. The religious contributions made by the Irish would continue. Kenrick was succeeded by John Joseph Kane, who was succeeded by Archbishop John Joseph Glennon. Glennon was the first cardinal for the Catholic Church in St. Louis and a native of County Westmeath. In more modern times, Reverend Charles Granville of St. Teresa's Parish organized the first soccer team in the city. Denny Long, an Irishman, as president of Anheuser-Busch, continued the support for soccer. The Christian Brothers, who were largely Irish, made important educational contributions as the Irish had done since the start of the century. Irish organizations in St. Louis. One gauge of the strength of an ethnic group is the number of formal organizations founded by them. West of the Mississippi, none did so sooner or with more variety than the Irish. The first ethnic benevolent society founded in the territory of Missouri began on February 19, 1818. The initial meeting was held at the house of Jeremiah Connor, former St. Louis sheriff. The list of members at that time reads like a who's who in early St. Louis. Thomas Brady, chairman, was one of the largest merchants in town. Hugh Rankin, another prominent businessman, was treasurer. Lawrence Ryan was secretary. Alexander Blackwell, Arthur McGinnis, and Thomas Hardy were organizers as well. Thomas English, James Timmon, Robert N. Chatterwood, and Hugh O'Neill were in attendance. Joseph Charles, a Presbyterian and first newspaper publisher in St. Louis, attended as well. Among the visiting committee in the initial meeting were John Timmon, Robert Rankin, and Francis Rochford. These families were well established in St. Louis. Timmon and Rankin were well known in business circles, and Francis Rochford was the first instructor in English in the city. To gain some idea of the stature of the organization, it was one of only 4 listed in the 1821 Directory of St. Louis. The initial meeting of the Aaron Benevolent Society was followed by the appearance of the Irish Immigrant and Corresponding Society, which was an outgrowth of the original meeting. Jeremiah Connor was named president on October 21, 1819. John Mullanphy, James McGonigal, Alexander Blackwell, and Arthur McGinnis were organizers. This Irish organization was the first of many to appear in St. Louis. Years later, German societies and organizations would appear as their population increased. In 1818, the Irish were the only organized ethnic benevolent group in the city. The organization fostered the arrival of new immigrants and lent a helping hand upon arrival in St. Louis. According to their papers, they could extend welcome to any immigrant, not just the Irish. March 17, 1820 is the first recorded date of a St. Patrick's Day procession in St. Louis. It was part of the festivities of the Irish Immigrant and Corresponding Society. The following Irish organizations have been found in St. Louis. 1. The Aaron Benevolent Society, Irish Immigrant and Corresponding Society, founded 1818. 2. The Missouri Hibernian Relief Society, 1827. Organized by Irish immigrants who then outnumbered all other Europeans except the French. James C. Lynch was the first president. William Pigot, secretary. Formed to relieve those distressed in their native homeland and aid in immigration. 3. The Friends of Ireland, November 8, 1841. Organized to relieve sufferers in Ireland. 4. The Irish Immigrant Society. Founded in the 1840s, John O'Fallon served as president. 5. Irish Revolutionary Society, Fenians. This organization was outlawed by the Roman Catholic Church. The Western Banner was a strong advocate of Fenianism until 1860. Founded in America by John O'Mahony after the Rising of 1848 in Ireland. 6. The Shamrock Society, 1854. Starting with 7 members, its organizer, Patrick Moran, saw its ranks grow to over 300. Formed as a result of the worst riots in St. Louis history against the Irish Catholics, the society was initially formed for the relief of victims of the riots. Known members: N. J. Dolan, William Hughes, William Delahunt, Patrick O'Neill, Edward Lester, and Martin Keary. 7. The United Sons of Erin Benevolent Society. Among its prominent members, Francis Noonan, Dr. W. H. Brennan, James Bly, and the Reverend James Henry, its founder. 8. The Knights of St. Patrick, founded in 1867. 9. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, in 1870. Soon after the formation of the original chapter, almost every district in the city had a division. The organization still survives in St. Louis. It was founded there by John Tye, Andrew Ferry, Peter Leonard, and Patrick Coughlin. 10. Father Matthew's Young Men's Total Abstinence and Benevolent Society. Founded in St. Louis in 1870. All members were of Irish lineage. Charter members included Thomas Fox, Edward Devoy, James Hagerty, John D. Hagerty, and James McGraw. By 1873, the council had 1,300 members, which declined to 350 in 1883. The purpose of the organization was to encourage temperance and provide a fund for the families of deceased members. 11. Sarsfield Club, founded in 1896 by Irish Americans. 12. The Irish American Club, founded in the 1920s by Reverend Peter O'Rourke, pastor of St. Mark's Church. Other Irish organizations formed about which we have no information. One can easily see that the Irish American held close ties with other Irishmen. They worked actively to encourage immigration to America. Today, few of these organizations have survived or are even remembered. This is due to the small numbers of Irish allowed to immigrate to America in the 20th century, as well as cultural assimilation. The role which these organizations played in bringing the Irish American into the mainstream of society is undeniable. That they were successful was part of the reason for their decline. Famine Irish. In 1849, Irish immigrants docked in St. Louis dying from cholera. Hordes of young street Arabs, neglected and parentless, would haunt the streets of the city. Neglected and abused, they did not attend school. Living in unsanitary tenements, these were the famine arrivals. Continued settlement. The Irish continued to arrive in St. Louis prior to the famine years of 1845 to 1852. Settling near the old cathedral, they flowed northward. By 1843, St. Patrick's Parish had been founded at 6th and Biddle, its cornerstone being blessed by Bishop Kenrick. This was an area where many new immigrants passed into the city. Tenement housing, coffee houses, and street fighting were common to this area, which became known as Battle Row. 10 years after the founding of St. Patrick's, St. Bridget of Arran Parish was established. St. Lawrence O'Toole's Parish and St. Malachi's would soon follow. These parishes were set up to serve the needs of the growing numbers of Irish immigrants. The earlier Irish had established themselves well in the city. The number of businesses in the 1840 to 1841 Directory of St. Louis were equal to that of any other nationality. The Hibernian Society was listed therein. Anti-immigrant sentiments were represented in 1840 with the publication of the St. Louis New Era newspaper. The paper was used by the nativists to campaign against the two major immigrant groups, the Irish and German Catholics. Politically, the Irish still held sway. In 1842, the first foreign-born and first Democratic mayor in the city was elected. By 1844, the tide was turning. Riots and mob attacks on Catholic institutions increased as more of the new Irishmen arrived. This was not the warm, friendly welcome the Irish had received at the turn of the century there. As the Famine Irish arrived in town, the troubles grew worse. These new Irish were poor, lacking in education, and searching for survival rather than adventure. Their behavior and thrift was not that of the earlier immigrants. Often they brought unwanted illness with them. In 1849, Father John O'Hanlon, a native of Ireland, served St. Patrick's Parish. His book, Life and Scenery of Missouri, described the following conditions. Quote, as the survivors landed generally on the levee near St. Patrick's Church, messengers or deckhands, mostly Irish, came from each vessel to find groups of infected persons on deck, lying in moribund state. Unquote. In 1849, a cholera epidemic broke out following the arrival of a large number of immigrants by boat. In the minds of the citizens of the city, the Irish bore no small degree of blame for the epidemic. Perhaps the most serious riot of the times would occur in 1854, a year when many of the Irish were disqualified to vote as foreign-born. The Shamrock Society was formed to assist victims of this riot and came to have over 300 members. Living conditions were less than desirable. It was happily reported that in 1853 there was no prevailing disease striking down the city. That year, the Irish Immigrant Society actively assisted 2,053 immigrants, of an estimated total of 8,000 new Irish arrivals. The German immigration totaled 11,473 via New Orleans and 6,876 via the Ohio and Illinois rivers. One-third of the Germans were said to have remained in St. Louis. As a result of hazardous voyage from Ireland and deplorable living conditions of the Irish immigrants, the mortality rate was high. Orphans were found in the streets of the city, a large percentage of them Irish. During the heart of the famine in 1849, the Catholic Orphan Association of St. Louis had its hands full. John Haverty served as vice president and Thomas Flaherty as secretary under Brian Mullanphy's leadership with this organization. Jobs were not always available. With the construction of the railroad to the iron mines, St. Louis became an iron smelting center. Factory wages were $2 to $2.50 a day. Other workers could expect to receive $12 per week. Dock workers were usually paid at the rate of 25 cents per hour. Many of the famine immigrants would find employment later on the docks and railroads. The Kerry Patch and a new wave of Irish were to come into being after 1845 in St. Louis under most unfortunate conditions. The Irish Ghetto, Kerry Patch Dreams. Fond memories may be heard today of the Kerry Patch and the Irish crowd, or the Irish Patch. But from where do they stem? According to reports of the day, the Patch was a home for poverty, disease, and wandering orphans. Indeed, at one time in America, an orphan was assumed to be Irish. Despite these conditions, the Irish were noted for behaving as if they lived in marble halls, according to one amazed writer. This perplexed the author, who had previously described the conditions of the area. The Kerry Patch in St. Louis was founded as a result of the Great Famine immigration from Ireland. The role of the Irish had been quite different prior to 1845. The first 20 years of the century saw the fur trading post of St. Louis rise to a notable city. By 1850, and the coming of the famine immigrants, St. Louis was the fifth largest city in the nation. The Irish had played a major role in the growth, communication, and social structure of the city. By 1845, the old Irish families had found a home for themselves west of the Mississippi. The famine Irish, on the other hand, were viewed as poor, disease-ridden immigrants. Huddled together in the big city ghettos, some of the older Irish families viewed the new arrivals with disdain as well. They threatened the established way of life and gave the Irish a bad name. How much more would other Americans fear these new immigrants, who were taking jobs and spreading disease? One of the earliest successful families in St. Louis was that of John Mullanphy. He was the first millionaire of the town. As the famine immigrants arrived in St. Louis, they settled in a forested area on the Mullanphy estate. In 1847, Bryan Mullanphy served as mayor of St. Louis at the peak of Irish immigration. In 1849, he brought the new Irish arrivals food and medicine during the cholera epidemic. His father had done the same in earlier years. Many immigrants docked in St. Louis near death. Those who had survived the voyage from Ireland were in desperate conditions. Bryan Mullanphy, after a visit to the Patch, went to a saloon and drew up his will establishing his famous Travelers' Aid Fund. This was but one example of the generosity of the Mullanphy family in St. Louis. John Mullanphy had conducted a personal campaign to establish orphan homes throughout the country. They had not forgotten just how new a family they were in America. The first shacks in the Kerry Patch were erected by Roger Hardy and Dennis Guerin in 1850. One-room thatched roof shanties sprang up everywhere, filled with entire families. The shanty Irish would soon be contrasted to the lace curtain Irish in St. Louis. What a great luxury it must have been to afford lace curtains. Those with lace curtains could afford to be concerned about more than just day-to-day survival. The earliest settlers probably came from County Kerry, although by 1880 there seems to be a wide variety of Irish names present from other counties in Ireland. Following the Celtic custom, each community had its chief or king. By public acclaim, Dennis Sheehan was the first king of the Kerry Patch in St. Louis. He lived on the southeast corner of 18th and Cass Avenue. Imprisoned during the Civil War at McDowell Medical College, upon his death, James Cullinan of County Cork became the new king of the Patch. The County Kerry population of the Patch allowed Cullinan to rule until the heir of the original king came of age. Jack Sheehan, the son of Dennis, reclaimed the throne in a torch parade back to the home of the original ruler at 18th and Cass Avenue. Jack Sheehan was the last king of the Patch. He died in the 1930s. The boundaries of the Patch were always changing. According to Jack, the area was bounded on the east by 16th Street, 19th on the west, O'Fallon on the south, and Cass Avenue on the north. Others have cited the peak of the Patch at 14th and O'Fallon. Looking back, largely unrecorded in existing histories, these settlements were thought unworthy of public note. Few commentaries were written about these slums except as condemnations or curiosities. One is lucky to find passing reference in county histories on the Irish settlements during the famine. Earlier Irish settlements are recognized even less. This valuable history has most often been preserved in the oral traditions of the Irish American families themselves. Homeless, poor, shanty Irish came to St. Louis with a dream. They had a price to pay to achieve that dream. Today, the price has been paid. Should we not look back in honor and amazement at those who shouldered the burden? Those dirty and diseased workers who built America have remained nameless and forgotten. We stand upon their shoulders, reaping their rewards. The conditions the famine immigrants endured has no parallel. Early Irish knew of poverty and hardship, to be sure. The unprecedented misery and hopelessness in Ireland brought the Irish to America in untold numbers after 1845. Conditions were not as bad as in the big cities back east, but they were bad enough in St. Louis. Cholera, plague, lack of plumbing, discrimination, menial labor, and cramped living conditions were all there. St. Louis, remember, had the largest foreign-born population of any city in America by 1860. Some of the reasons why St. Louis might have offered a warmer welcome to the Irish than cities in the East include: 1. The religious background of Missouri was strongly Catholic. 2. There was more room for settlement in the West. 3. The Irish held civil and social power in St. Louis since 1804. 4. St. Louis accommodated the largest foreign-born population in America. Sons and daughters of the Patch. Many later-day Irish Americans lay claim to the heritage of the Kerry Patch. The first generation to move up and out of the area might not have omitted the same. An area of poverty, fighting, street orphans, and social discrimination, it might not have been so romantic if you were living there at the time. It has been said that you wouldn't want to walk the streets after sunset in Kerry Patch. Only through great strength of character and effort did the Irish rise out of the ghetto into mainstream America. They advanced quickly as a result of their labors. The famine Irish on arrival likely took on jobs as manual laborers or maidservants. Some would no doubt stray and become graduated of the University of San Quentin. In the end, it is the story of human triumph, the fulfillment of an American dream. By the 1900s, the Kerry Patch was being absorbed into America. This was not a loss, but a victory for the Irish Americans, who had gained their proper rewards in society. From such deprived beginnings, many went forward into law, politics, and journalism. They continued the traditions established in the early 1800s in St. Louis. The fire and police departments became favored occupations. Missouri Senator Michael Kinney and Democratic Treasurer James J. Dwyer hailed from the Patch, as well as prominent doctors and lawyers. The role of the new immigrants and the lower class had often been prominent in sports. The Irish played no small role here in the years to come. As a sidelight, on April 16, 1860, John W. O'Connell, owner of a painting company, and J.D. Fitzgibbons, a builder, laid out the first baseball diamond at Cass and Jefferson Avenue. The Patch was a traditional Irish Catholic settlement, with new arrivals from Ireland regularly. The rich cultural flavor of the Patch and the private Catholic school system helped to maintain the values of the community. Many of its members went forward to benefit the general public. Similar settlements can be found throughout Missouri. Many were named for locations in Ireland. Donnybrook in Cape Girardeau and the Kerry Patch in Sedalia are but a few examples. The fact that they existed is often only known to a few individuals. The Irish role in early St. Louis. In 1804, the lands of Missouri came under American control for the first time. Upon the transfer of the land, French leader Colonel Delisle commanded Mr. Matthew McConnell and Dr. Samuel Dorsey, a surgeon of the fort. They were but two of the outstanding men to enter the region prior to statehood in 1821. Many had arrived in the 1700s. Settlers like Philip Fine, of Irish parents from Virginia, arrived in St. Louis in 1781. The first true Irish settlement was in place by 1798 in Missouri. The Irish settlers went on to become the leading citizens and developers of the town of St. Louis. By the time of statehood for Missouri, the Irish had established themselves in all aspects of St. Louis society and were the largest foreign-born element in the city. Joseph Murphy, the builder of the Murphy wagon in St. Louis, grew up in Ireland and came as a young boy to St. Louis prior to statehood. Those who had arrived prior to Murphy would set the stage for his future career. John Mullanphy had attempted to establish a colony of Celts near Florissant. Murphy was likely heading for this colony, for Mullanphy owned the property upon Murphy's arrival. The Mullanphys had arrived prior to 1810 and were a vital part of St. Louis well into the 1850s. Joseph Murphy would purchase one of his first properties from an earlier arrival, Joseph Christie. An Irish lawyer from Pennsylvania, Christie arrived in St. Louis in 1804. He helped found a newspaper in St. Louis and was appointed to the U.S. Land Office in 1820 to 1833. An early pioneer, in 1808 he came to make salt in Blackwater Township in Cooper County.
End of Part 4. Continue on to Part 5 of Missouri Irish. Copyright 2010 from the Irish Roots Cafe and IrishRoots.com.